All right, welcome back to another episode of Scuttlebutt. We're doing more Ukraine today, so no sweet horn getting the episode started. I'm Nick. I'm here with Vic.
Hey.
And William.
Howdy.
And we've got Col Woodbridge in the house today
Good morning, everyone.
to help us kind of wrap our arms around what's going on in Ukraine. So it is Thursday. Russia has a 40-mile-long convoy still slowly creeping towards Kiev, and the city in the south, Kherson. The city is Kherson. It was a dumb time for a brain fart, but the city was Kherson. Just forgot the name.
Mariupol or?
Mariupol hasn't fallen yet. The other one has fallen.
Starts with a K.
Yeah, the first Ukrainian major city, 300,000 people has fallen. So,
Yeah, but Mariupol is surrounded.
Yeah,
yeah,
according to the mayor.
Right.
yeah, but it has been surrounded for
Yeah.
a
And
little
then,
while now.
as of last night, there was still massive shelling just outside Kiev.
Yeah, and
and-
Kharkiv keeps getting just hammered.
Yeah. But yeah, so I guess to do a quick recap, last time the goal was to provide some context. I mean, it literally just kicked off, and I think we were trying to at least try to unpack, like, is there any validity historically to any of Russia's claims to the Ukraine, and then just provide a sort of a context of what the Ukraine means to Russia, what does Russia mean to Ukraine, and how did all of this sort of come to be? And
And we dug deep.
we dug pretty deep.
went
Yeah, I
way
mean, we
back.
went back to the
The Middle
to the,
Ages,
the
yeah.
Rus Vikings.
Yep.
And I think it's important because all of those things matter, especially when we're talking about empires that rise and fall.
Yeah.
And you've got this crossroads. I mean, I think at one point the Greeks occupied parts of the Ukraine
Yeah.
Ukraine, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, we're talking tons of history. But the reason we wanted to bring Colonel Woodbridge in today is to give us that really the educator's view and the military professional's view, and someone who can really help dissect what is happening. Well, not necessarily, like we talked before the show, you can't swing a stick without hitting some retired general or former operative or European expert.
So
But I
we-
think, what's that?
We have our retired colonel.
And
in
so
the
we've
room.
got our version, but we're going to hit a different angle, I think, on that. But at least just take the conversation to the next point now.
Yeah, so when things like this happen, certainly in legacy media, both network and cable network, the experts, the pundits, really enjoy a heyday of business, and they all have something to offer. You know, there's always a kernel of truth, a nugget of truth, and a nugget of insight from any of these folks. The only thing that kind of differentiates me, makes me any different, is so I, in my Marine Corps career, I had the good fortune to be the director of one of our PME schools that focuses a lot on operational art, on critical thinking, and on military history. But also, as a child of the 80s, a lot of my Marine Corps career, certainly the first third of it, was completely focused on the Soviet Union as the evil empire and the arch enemy of freedom and justice in the American way. And so learning how they fight, learning their tactics and operational art, learning at the tactical level how to identify and defeat or destroy their vehicles, meaning their equipment, because they are a large motorized, mechanized land force. So knowing what you're looking at on the battlefield and what that means in terms of the formation that you're facing, what you can expect next, and then how to defeat that formation using terrain and our weapons advantages, ate up my first 10 to 12 years in the Marine Corps. And for those veterans of my age, this is the war that never happened. This is the war that we trained for, we prepared for, that our services invested vast amounts in our nation, invested vast amounts of money into preparing for, being able to fight, and ultimately won at the strategic level by outspending the flawed communist regime of the Soviet Union and destroying them essentially, effectively, economically.
And ideologically as well.
Ideologically within places that had been part of the larger Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, plural USSR republics. Ukraine was one of those republics for a period of time. It was the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. But you mentioned the historic context. We can talk about that a little bit and how it's relevant to what's going on now. But again, looking at this really through the lens of PME, because there's a great real life, real time lesson going on right now, and then also from the what I call kind of the Throwback Thursday perspective of the Cold War era veteran who's not necessarily seen this movie before because it never really played out, but read the script a lot, over and over again.
But I think this is a really, I mean, at least from my perspective, then as a different generation of retiree, this has been an interesting time for me as someone. I mean, sort of conversely, I spent almost my entire time in the Marine Corps reacting to these sorts of international events. Something would happen and then we would go. That's not happening now, and no one is going. And so it's very interesting to sort of, and I don't want to be flippant, but in a way, be the old guys in the Muppets that are up in the bleachers now, able to watch the show unfold and then comment. And so, this has been strange. And I my wife and I even talked about it a little bit. Is that there is still that sense in me to like run towards the sound of chaos. But it's not our thing anymore, and it's not. So there is a distance, and I'm sure, sir, like you felt some of that now as you're reflecting back the whole Throwback Thursday idea. But I just wanted to throw that perspective in, is that this is the first time that something like this has happened, and we aren't all like going to SIFT to check out new gear.
That's correct, and with the exception of some elements of the Division Ready Brigade out of Fort Bragg, some other joint force logistics elements from the Defense Logistics Agency and service logisticians. Nobody is deploying.
Right.
Right. Nobody is deploying, and there's reasons for that, and they're very good reasons. And this sort of feeds into one subject area that we can look at is looking at what's occurring right now as a living lesson in the nature of war as defined by Karl von Clausewitz in the 18th century. All right, that is the foundational theory of war, and the description of or explanation of the nature of war as Clausewitz laid it out. Is a great lens to look at what's going on right now. So, from that definition, he identifies war as subject to the interplay of three elements. The first element is that of subordination as an instrument of policy to reason. So, war is subject to reason. There's a rational reason, a logical reason why one party goes to war with another, and one party fights back against another. That's a reason. So what's the reason that Russia, under Vladimir Putin, has invaded Ukraine? What is the reason that the United States and the rest of NATO are not, or the Western European countries, and some Eastern European countries, and Turkey, which is both European and Middle Eastern, are not going? Meaning not deploying forces and combat power in aid of Ukraine. There's a reason there. So fundamentally, the reason for the Russian invasion in many ways boils down to sort of two subject areas, two things. First is financial, is money. Russia has a very limited and pressured economy. Their sole legitimate export that brings in revenue is energy, oil, natural gas. The oil pipelines go through Ukraine, and Russia has to pay tax to Ukraine for that use of real estate. That reduces their net revenue from their energy sales to Western Europe and the rest of the world. Problem number one, fixed by essentially creating another client state, a puppet government that will reduce or eliminate those financial drains on the export of Russian oil. Problem number one. Problem number two is intangible. It is more of a population control at home issue. It is keeping the Russian population focused on something and giving them something that certainly the supporters of Vladimir Putin want, which is a return to the prestige of the former Soviet Union, Imperial Russia before that, and the sort of the cultural heritage of the Russians as the hegemon of Eastern Europe. So that's the reason. What's the reason that the Ukraine is fighting back and has not capitulated? Well, because they don't want to be part of Russia. They have striven over decades to be an independent nation. They have a somewhat more robust economy based on not just energy and natural resources, but also on farming, on agriculture. They have always been the breadbasket of that part of the world.
Quite literally, because it's wheat.
Yes, exactly. And so now also, what is the reason why the United States and other Western European and some Eastern European nations are not committing forces to this right now? The reason, the rationale, the logic, the subordination as an instrument of policy, you have to really kind of pass two tests. First, what is the strategic interest of the United States in Ukraine? And solely opposing a dictator like Putin and that sort of unprovoked aggression is not sufficient strategy in this context, because the other piece to it is the cost of going to war with another peer nuclear power.
Viscerally, though, it seems like that should be justified.
Absolutely. On the emotional level, and that now gets to the second element from Clausewitz's lens or explanation of the nature of war. And he defines that as the element of primordial violence, hatred, enmity, and irrational forces, a natural irrational force. All right, those are the emotions at play. And that certainly is playing out again live on everyone's media, that the Ukrainian people are not making a rational decision that, well, we could probably get along with this. They are fighting on a visceral, emotional level, and they are using their nationalism, something that has been in diminishing supply internationally over the last few decades, to really define their identity. So there is, at all levels, that element of natural force that has its own logic, its own language, and it is, again, violence, hatred, and everything that comes along with that, fear, uncertainty. The third element of Clausewitz's explanation is the play of chance and probability. Okay, where the creative spirit of the leader, the soldier, the defender at any level, tactical, strategic, comes into play. So taking advantage of this situation as it plays out, looking at how this operation is playing out, you've essentially got a lesson both in that nature of war at the strategic and operational and tactical levels, and you've got a lesson in what we learned so well in the 80s, how the then Soviets, now Russians, fight with the resources that they have. So, again, if we look at the other sides of this, the primordial violence, the hatred, etc., you'll see that play out, and we are seeing that play out in the tactics that the Russians are employing as they operate in Ukraine. Indiscriminate use of area destruction weapons like tube and rocket artillery is incredibly violent, and by nature of its indiscriminacy, invariably creates suffering with the most vulnerable parts of the population, the civilian population who are not fighting, women, children, the elderly, the sick and infirm. That's who's going to suffer the most. And once again, a very clear illustration of an element of the historical nature of war. That nature never changes. Those elements never change. The character of war, the types of weapons you fight with, using other technologies to exploit other domains, that's the character of war, and that constantly changes. So what we're seeing here is illustration in really both of those elements of the theory of war, but certainly that lens of the unchanging nature of war is alive and well. Everything we're seeing plays into that. The wild card, that play of chance and probability, again, on clear display. I have little doubt, again, based on the situation that we've seen develop over the last few months, and knowing how the Soviet/Russian military fights, that what we've watched for the last week or so was really the opening gambit of an operation. All right, the first phases, if you will. Mm-hmm. You execute those opening gambits for two purposes. One, you may, depending on the reaction of your adversary, reach early victory. They may capitulate very quickly. You may decapitate the regime by finding, fixing, and destroying their leadership, whether that's an individual or an organization or a city. But it also, as in a chess match, the opening is probably the most important part of the game because it sets up all subsequent moves. So what we're seeing on the ground now and in the air is that opening gambit did not achieve early victory. The nature of operations are one phase or one operation ends when one of three things happen. And we haven't reached it yet. But in terms of a phase, you either have victory, you have defeat, and you fail in your attempt, or you reach some sort of stalemate, in which case you have to then create a new operational plan. So a branch plan or a sequel plan. So what we're seeing now as this week plays out is the early victory gambit has not worked. Overall defeat or failure in the operation has not come into play yet. It's too soon to tell. And so what we're seeing is movement into the next phase, which can probably best be defined as 20th, early 21st century siege terror warfare. All right. So again, using their strengths of motorized, mechanized forces, and particularly their strength in tube and rocket artillery, the Russians are going to do what has worked for them in the past, and it's the recent past. The study is the battles of Grozny in Chechnya. Mm-hmm. They will systematically lay siege in the old vernacular. They will isolate an urban area, and they will begin deliberate reduction through fire, and that's firepower and fire itself, the incendiary capability of those weapons. And as Henry V put it during the 100 Years' War, war without fire is like a sausage without mustard. You are going to deliberately produce casualties, killing civilians and military in the city indiscriminately. You are going to indiscriminately destroy structure, real estate in that city, and you're going to continue to tighten that until you get what you want. Either a capitulation, a surrender of the city to you and your forces, or death of everyone who can fight in that city. All right, so it is a strategy of annihilation sitting out there. That's what generates the terror aspect to it, in addition to the inordinate pain, suffering, and ultimately destruction of any military capacity. But only certain nations can and will do this.
And I was gonna add, like, one of their strengths, I think, is definitely, I don't want to call them immoral. That's probably too much of a universalist statement. But they are not hindered by their need for international validation.
That's correct. That's correct. In other words, putting it in very plain English, they don't care what people think.
Right.
They're already, quote unquote, the international villains. You can't change that view as a government, as a nation. Where it starts to break apart is among the Russian people themselves. However, that really isn't that much of a threat to that regime. And the reason being is, for the better part of a century, they have ample practice at controlling that population.
Sure. Yep. They just have to turn the lights on in the gulags. That's it.
Do you think that, because this is really like Russia's like first big war against a near peer like threat, like in the age of like social media, where in an area of the world that like most Westerners, I mean, not to be like flippant, like care about. Do you think how do you think like that's changed like their approach, or has it?
So there's a couple of things to consider there, and we probably should have said this. I know you all have talked about it in the previous podcasts, but right up front is we are limited to open source intelligence. None of us here work in the intelligence community of this country. We are not talking about any classified reporting, classified imagery. We don't have access to that. What we have access to is what everybody else has access to, what you see and hear.
And our own experiences.
Exactly,
yeah.
Exactly. But in terms of what's going on right now, you see and hear what everybody else does. And the key points to remember there are it is extremely difficult to get to the truth of what's happening. Because the truth is being manipulated at the sources. So in other words, the Russians are manipulating information. They are conducting information operations or operations in the information environment to achieve their own purposes. That's misinformation and control or not distributing information to their own people and to the international community. So telling untruths, or just not talking at all. The Ukrainians are also operating in the information environment in order to build more international support for their cause, to create more of a heroic narrative of the defenders of their nation, their homeland, at all levels, and that serves their purpose of creating more defenders at home and hopefully creating more support for them coming from outside Ukraine. And they're using, to William's question, they're using all media to do that. Both sides are. Who's better at it? I think it would depend on who you really want to influence and who the audience is. The Russians are very good at using all media, again, to control their own population. When you're external and you look at their propaganda, agitprop, their use of information, it's pretty transparently BS. You can really hear the echoes of Soviet era propaganda in a lot of this.
Yeah, and throw in the fact that some of their state media, like pre-written, dispatches,
right,
have been leaked with like European dignitaries talking about how much they fear Russia and stuff. It's pretty
That's
gnarly
classic.
to read.
It is classic again out of the old Soviet playbook. On the Ukrainian side, and partially because of their, particularly in Western Ukraine, their more European Western focus and affiliations, they've taken this a little better at communicating to that external audience. and creating that narrative. Again, this heroic narrative of the president fighting on the streets with his people, the mayors of the city, the Klitschko brothers out there, and others, other professional athletes, other people with certainly the means to flee, the means to go elsewhere, but no, they're going to stay and fight because it's their nation. That creates a very sympathetic narrative. And it resonates very well here in a country like the United States, where this is one of the things that we all sort of pride ourselves on is, we're all men of peace until somebody comes in my yard, and then we're going to pick up weapons and fight. We that's part of our narrative too. Well, we don't fight until we're attacked.
Going back to what you said earlier, though, sir, I mean, there's generations where this was their life since 1947.
Yes.
This was the thing. And so I think there's definitely a galvanized spirit of like, this is what we were talking about. I mean, remember, and I think it's been mentioned in other areas, but I mean, Mitt Romney called this out in 2012, and he almost got laughed off the stage. But I mean, how vindicated is he right now?
No, it's true. And when you look at, so let's look at that history of the Cold War. Yes, we prepared and we invested in multiple layers of deterrence. Most significantly, we invested in nuclear deterrence, which is easy when you come right down to it. It's a math problem. It's called mutual assured destruction. Nobody wins. And as I've said earlier, the only upside is nuclear winter cancels out climate change and global warming. So you got that going for you. However, short of that, with that mutual assured destruction balanced equation over the top of you, we also invested and focused on conventional deterrence, which at that time meant really two main things. The development of conventional weapons that were, although not as numerous, were more capable than the enemy's weapons. A tow missile has several thousand meters more standoff than the main gun of a T-54, T-55, T-62, T-72 main battle tank. So a qualitative difference in combat capability in weapon systems. Thing one. Thing two, actual presence. At that time, we had several 100,000 Americans in Europe, stationed all over Germany, Britain, etc. So we had our nuclear arsenal forward deployed as needed in the triad. We had our conventional forces forward deployed in numbers with the focus and the training on fighting that conventional fight, and to a large degree creating a competition of resources on both sides. So we outspend them, they try to compete with us. They build more, we build better. They build 100 T-80 tanks, we build 10 M1A1 main battle tanks. Longer range, better defense, and we complement that with helicopters that can attack helicopters that can fire tow missiles, Hellfire missiles, etc. So we qualitatively unbalance that. But what really happened? We didn't fight on the plains of Germany. We didn't fight the Fulda Gap. We never had to land the Norwegian air-landed Marine Expeditionary Brigade in Norway to pull equipment out of the nuclear-proof caves and attack the Russian forces from their right flank, the northern flank of NATO.
We never had a Red Dawn.
We never had Red Dawn in this country. Yeah. The Cubans never parachuted into Muncie.
Yeah, no one came up through Mexico.
Or Canada. It never happened. But what did happen is we wound up fighting proxy wars for the entire time. We fought what could be viewed as a proxy war or getting involved in someone else's civil war in Korea and in Vietnam. We fought proxy wars at the low level in Central America and Africa.
Sandinistas. And,
We fought a proxy war in Afghanistan. And, again, your level of involvement really makes things more palatable at home in terms of public opinion, foreign policy, but continues that constant struggle of opposition. Don't let them do something without us doing something too.
and then back the people that are against them also.
Well, and that's perhaps where this may wind up going. So again, talking about sort of the phasing of what happens, the problem with the current operational design as we see it at this phase of isolating cities, reducing them with fire, and essentially an attrition-based operational design focused on those urban areas. Ultimately, that only really works if you kill everyone. As long as there are some people who are unwilling to capitulate, there is the potential for an insurgency, for a war among the people, which we have certainly dealt with as American forces for the better part of the last 20 years. So, the hopeful or the wishful thinking that we'll come in, we'll destroy these cities, we'll kill the president, we'll kill these mayors, we'll deprive them of a lot of combat power, they will capitulate, we'll put in a puppet regime, does not account for the fact that some people may be dedicated enough to oppose that. That's good from the adversary perspective. But then what do they need? As any unconventional warrior will tell you, for an insurgency to succeed, it needs that willpower amongst that population of the people who are not getting their essentially political goals met any other way. It requires a safe haven base of operations for those people to prepare and develop their combat capabilities, and it requires external support. A safe haven where that external support can be delivered to those people who are training to use it and then working their way back into their homeland or attacking adversary targets outside the homeland. Sometimes we call that terrorism, sometimes we call that guerrilla warfare or insurgency, but we fought against it throughout the Cold War, and by fighting against it, you learn how to do it. So we have had, in the past, a very robust unconventional warfare capability in the combination of our Special Operations Forces and parts of our Central Intelligence Agency. The Operations Directorate of the Central Intelligence Agency are the experts in doing that, and it's their responsibility. Again, open source media, what it is right now, I can't confirm or say categorically that this sort of thing is going on right now, but the plans and capabilities are certainly there.
There's a playbook getting dusted off.
Exactly. And so of those requirements, from what we see, we appear to have a dedicated adversary population within the Ukrainian people, rallying around their president, their mayors. They're willing to fight. They will continue to be willing to fight. Stipulate that. There are available to them safe havens in other nations, Poland, Hungary, Romania. Can we, the West, the NATO allies, flow lethal aid or combat power to those safe haven nations? Of course we can. So that playbook is there. And if this does continue to drag on, that's the way to do this. That's what we did in Afghanistan to a lesser degree. That's what we did in Angola. And in Central America.
Iran-Iraq war
helped to fund other operations, but we did support Iraq against Iran. Again, because of the what had occurred during the Iranian Revolution. So that's another discussion day.
So I guess the question then is that, as we're dusting off playbooks and we're looking at this sort of thing, I guess thinking of Kilcullen's view of insurgency and counterinsurgency, as we dust off our playbooks, Russia starts to dust off theirs.
Yes.
Grozny had the benefit from the Russian standpoint of being within their borders.
Mm-hmm.
This is now a sovereign nation, and they're going to try to attempt that. I see that as going very badly for them. And I mean, you talk about like anybody who may be on the fence about whether they're going to participate in insurgency. You do something like Grozny, all of a sudden you have a bunch of people who are in.
Exactly.
And you have to do it 13 times in Ukraine, whereas in Grozny it was
It's one big
under
city.
heavy
Yes.
sanctions.
Yes, and a much smaller theater. They never had to do it in Crimea or the Don River estuary, again because that's eastern Ukraine, and you have a very sympathetic population there who probably focuses more towards Russia. So
Yeah, the calculus is on their side.
exactly,
For that one.
exactly. But what you're talking about, that perception of Russian actions backfiring. Again, many good historical examples of that. The French in Algeria, the French fighting a Muslim insurgency in Algeria. Again, very public overreaction and brutality galvanizes the opposition, makes them more inclined to oppose you, and that could very well play out here. But again, also dial back, the Soviets quite literally wrote the book on insurgency, and in doing so, they learn counterinsurgency. They know how to control that movement, and the level of brutality and the level of infiltration required. So how do you break up that sort of insurgency? You put your people in among the insurgents. It's an intelligence fight. And so they are very inclined to do that. They've got a capability in the form of Ukrainians themselves who align with Russia, who are willing to become those double agents, if you will, traitors or infiltrators. And you start to take down the insurgency from the inside that way, something we were never able to do. We were never able to do it in Vietnam. We were certainly not able to do it in Iraq or Afghanistan. The other thing to kind of just keep measure in here is since the 1970s, our national capabilities for unconventional warfare have been drastically reduced. So we may have the playbook, but we don't necessarily have the volume, the number of players anymore. And so that's that
Because
was
like certain agencies have been mothballed or rolled into a larger conglomerate.
and the focus of those agencies has moved from direct action, both in terms of intelligence collection and unconventional warfare operations, to imagery analysis and global situational awareness. So, a shift in focus, and again, that happened largely during the 1970s as a result of some extra legal things going on, and also just a shifting in the national will.
Yeah, I guess a good point for anybody who's interested in this perspective is Charlie Wilson's war.
Yes.
It's unbelievable.
Well, and the entire story arc, if you will, of Soviet and U.S. involvement in Afghanistan, and by extension Pakistan and other areas of the Middle East. Following the origins of that story arc, using the lens of the nature of war, there's a lot to be learned there. The rationale behind Brezhnev's decision to go into Afghanistan and to essentially annex that country, put in a puppet regime, were valid at the time. He was looking at two things: externally to what just occurred in the Islamic Revolution in Iran. In some people's, in Charlie Wilson's war, they refer to that as the crazies taking over. And then looking internally at Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, the Muslim minority Soviet socialist republics of the old USSR. And the concern of that type of Islamic extremism working its way back into the Soviet Union. Oh, by the way, Chechnya, Dagestan, Ossetia, much of the Caucasus, also, with the exception of Georgia and Armenia, subject to that same type of ideological infiltration. That's one of the other things to remember about the Soviet legacy here. Ideology is everything. Mm-hmm. I mean, fundamentally, being a true believer in the workers' paradise and the communist cause created the strength of the Soviet Union. That really isn't there anymore. It's more national Russianness now, and that may not go as far. It's easy to re-educate someone into a true communist. It's very hard to re-educate someone into being a true Russian, because you either are or you aren't. And where Putin has done some brilliant information operations is in leveraging kind of the historical, cultural roots of Russian greatness. Oddly enough, going furthest back to a hero who was, in the Middle Ages, a Ukrainian king and prince. In the 1200s, the late 1200s, the Prince of Novgorod, Alexander Nevsky, defended the motherland against, in this case, German and Lithuanian invaders coming from the west.
But wasn't Khrushchev Ukrainian?
Yeah, he was.
Yes, yes. That's why he was so, that's why he looked so well fed. He grew up in the breadbasket. But he was one of the ones who survived.
But I guess to that point, though, sir, in mentioning, influences of the West, so the information or the gray zone, I guess part of this is that we're sort of like NFL scouts on the sidelines with our clipboards. We're watching gray zone operations play
That's right.
out.
Absolutely.
And so one of the things is we're looking at that is
well, we're watching gray zone operations play out, but we are also watching a very classic 20th, early 21st century war of fire and maneuver play out.
Yeah.
My point there is we're looking at in the way the Russians are operating on the ground, what happens when we're not there. All right. So my specific example is everyone talks about, Nick mentioned, a 40-mile long column of Russian armor and mechanized forces working their way very deliberately along essentially one axis of advance, one road, several linear roads. Taking their time. All right. From the American way of war perspective, that is the best thing in the world for the United States Air Force, United States Navy, and Marine Corps attack aviation, fixed wing and rotor wing attack aviation. That is a 40-mile long linear target if you have the assets in the air, if you can control the air. And so we've seen that play out in the past. In the first Gulf War, north of Kuwait City, the Republican Guard fleeing back to Iraq created the linear target that later was called the Highway of Death. Right? And that is a real thing. When we fight in that environment, you never see those tactics being used. It's just not safe. You can't mass along a linear target like that. Not when you're fighting the Americans. Well, they know they're not fighting the Americans, so there it is. They play that out. So that, in that regard, yes, this is gray zone, but this is also classic conventional ground warfare. The use of artillery and rocket artillery against urban targets, against other targets, that's classic Soviet fighting. When we learned this back in the 80s, they find you with their motorized mobile reconnaissance. They fix you in place with mechanized and armored formations, and then they kill you with artillery and finish you off with more armor and more mechanized formations because they have that ability to attack in depth. That's what they're doing right now.
So you spoke a lot on the Russian strategies and tactics. What can you speak from? I guess so far we've seen. Obviously, in spite of the information we're getting, the Ukrainian response to that.
So what you see is a Russian. Again, the Ukrainians were an Eastern Bloc country. They're using essentially Russian defensive tactics. They're falling back into built-up areas because of the cost calculus involved with fighting in a built-up area. they're sort of conducting Stalingrad in reverse. All right. So in World War II, the Russians, the Soviets, effectively defended their nation by investing the city of Stalingrad, forcing the Germans and some Ukrainians who were German sympathizers to invest the combat power of trying to take that city and fight building by building, house by house, room by room, and ultimately spend and exhaust themselves and reach that culminating point where they can no longer generate combat power. And then the chance and probability kicks in, Russian winter. And so between those two things, you essentially annihilated entire army groups of the German army that spent themselves. Culminating point is an important doctrinal, theoretical factor to put into play here. When the Russians have not reached a culminating point yet, certainly not strategically or operationally. Some tactical units have, running out of fuel, you need to be refueled. You don't, when things breaking maintenance-wise, exactly running out of ammunition potentially, that's the wrong way to do it. You want to pause your tactical operations prior to reaching that culminating point. If you extend past the culminating point, you're extremely vulnerable because you're essentially fixed in place and limited to what you're doing. So the Ukrainians know that, and I think they're also, again, probably more effectively employing operations in the information environment in that effort to gain additional international legitimacy and international support for what's going on. Legitimacy, we're all with you. Hey, even our own members of Congress and professional athletes are wearing, yellow and blue, and we're standing with the Ukrainian people. Those memes started like within 24 hours on Facebook. So that's easy. Providing actual lethal aid and support on the ground is much harder. And supposedly there are some groups out there, old veterans going to get together and we're going to go and help them and fight. There's a long history of that in this country too. We had private citizens going to fight in the Spanish Civil War between World War I and World War II, actually fighting on the communist side in that Civil War to oppose the fascists. So there's history of that, but in the big picture, does that turn the tide? No. It can send a very clear strategic message, both domestically and internationally. But in terms of international law and the legality of combatants, they are not legal combatants. Mm-hmm. And so you have to be willing to risk that.
Yeah, and so I guess kind of circling back around the beginning, talking about what actually could make an impact. Russia is chased the dragon for oil, but that's the one thing we haven't sanctioned yet. So,
who is dependent on that oil?
Well,
Western Europe.
Yeah.
And to a degree, we buy Russian oil here as well.
Yeah.
Some would argue that we have taken our most important strategic piece off the chessboard voluntarily by essentially walking away from being a net exporter of energy. And so, again, there are domestic political reasons for that. What end of the spectrum you're on determines whether you think those are good reasons or not. But in terms of this conflict and the strategic impact of that resource, it's a terrible move.
Yeah, because for us, though, the impact isn't particularly high. Like the global market affects us, obviously.
Correct.
We're like 98% Western Hemisphere.
That's right.
Oil.
But for Western Europe,
yeah,
for our NATO allies,
that can become a problem.
Right. And so, another key point there, and we didn't really talk or delve into this that much, but nations can support each other. Nations can be friendly, can be allied. Wait a minute, you're only allied when there is a treaty signed. Right. Your ally, that is almost under international law, that is a binding agreement of mutual something, mutual defense in the case of NATO. So all the member nations of NATO agree, among other things, that an attack on one is an attack on all. That has played out in the last 10, 20 years in different ways. NATO viewed 9/11 as an attack on the United States, a NATO member, and thus NATO forces, NATO member nations, provided forces for operations in Afghanistan. That is a follow-through of the NATO Mutual Defense Treaty. On the other hand, Turkey is a NATO member, part of that alliance. Turkey has had attacks on their sovereign territory and their forces as both a spillover of the war in Syria and an insurgency amongst the Kurds of their population who also live in Syria, bases, havens in Afghanistan, Syria, and elsewhere. And NATO has done nothing to assist Turkey with that attack. So some would say that the alliance sort of is subject to interpretation at times, depending on who's being attacked. But ultimately, that's the backbone of Europe. The old saying about NATO is it has really three purposes: keep America involved in Europe, keep Russia out of Europe, and keep the Germans down so they don't do it again. That's worked brilliantly over the last 60, 70 years. In recent years, it's had some pulling and tugging at it. Interestingly, the other area that competes in some ways, or is another friction point with NATO, is the European Union. Mm-hmm. The EU is an economic body. It grew out of resourcing and trade agreements so that all the member nations would pay the same prices for coal and iron, and then it became transportation. If you got to move your coal and iron, you don't want to have to pay tolls going through other people's countries. So the Schengen Agreement allows movement amongst the EU nations. It had a tangent called the Eurozone, where we're going to have common currency in some areas. So not all members of the EU are in the Eurozone and vice versa, and not all members of the EU are in NATO and vice versa. Then in the early 2000s, the EU started to dip its toe into common defense and created competition for things like the NATO Ready Brigades. So if I'm one country, if I'm a small country, I have limited combat power, limited forces, do I keep those forces on a high readiness level to provide to the NATO alliance, or do I keep them to provide to the EU? Tough question for smaller countries and even bigger ones. So interesting that what has President Zelensky done? So NATO is the tripwire that Russia has said we will not accept Ukraine as part of NATO, but he's petitioning to become part of the EU.
Yeah. Yeah, they had their candidacy status confirmed, yesterday, 2
Yes.
days ago?
Yep, recently.
Yeah,
So, okay, President Putin, Vladimir, the other Vladimir, we're not going near your tripwire, your line in the sand about NATO, but we're part of the EU, which certainly has economic and social benefits and may actually have a military benefit as well. Oh, by the way, that's one of the reasons why Putin very publicly makes statements about the readiness of his nuclear forces.
And I wanted to get on that. I know, really appreciate you taking the time here, sir. But we were talking earlier before the show started about trigger lines and tyrants and conventional deterrence. And so, as you just mentioned, we all understand nukes and mutual assured destruction. And when we think nukes as sort of a public consciousness, we think huge missiles that fly up into space, then come down, it's a flash, and then we're all, whoever's left is battling with cockroaches for survival. But there's a smaller version of that. And the thing that keeps people, tyrants and despots and crazy people, from executing those things is that there's this conventional deterrence, and they feel I've got enough distance between the loss of my worldview and these tactical nukes that I can play the long game, whether financially or conventionally. I can stall this thing out and maintain my power without having to go. Now, if we start talking culminating points, we start talking about being embedded in a long war that they can't sustain. We're talking about heavy, heavy sanctions. We have now not just a gap, but a chasm between conventional deterrence and nuclear, the action of nuclear threat. As much as we want to cheer on the Ukrainians and that resolution and fight for liberty and all of the things that make what they're doing, and Zelensky and the Klitschko brothers, I mean, all of the things, and the 80,000 or so people that are going back into the Ukraine, like all of the wonderful things about this, there is an aspect of it where we need to be careful, because if Putin reaches his culminating point and he is vulnerable and a caged animal, and we clearly see he's crazy enough, if he doesn't feel like he has another tool in his kit, he's going to use the wrecking ball to hit the nail into the board if we take away all of the hammers.
That's a legitimate concern. The flip side of that is and as a matter of defense policy, stated public defense policy for generation, there's sort of no such thing as a tactical nuclear weapon. Yes, of course there is, in terms of technical specifications, smaller payload,
The
lower
suitcase
your
thing
yield.
that everybody's
Yes.
afraid about. And then,
Lower yield, neutron radiation. So something that does not destroy. It doesn't have an enormous explosive effect. The blast effect is reduced. The radiation effect is increased by certain technology in neutron weapons. Battlefield nukes. Again, Throwback Thursday. Nuclear artillery shells for 155 millimeter howitzers that every Army and Marine artillery officer learns how to employ and adjust fire, and where the release authority rests for those weapons. The reality of it is, as stated policy, is that use of a tactical nuclear weapon like that immediately brings strategic nuclear response. So would you ever use if you're going to get a strategic nuclear response, do a strategic attack, and you trigger the mutual assured destruction piece, at least within certain cities and the East Coast, other key facilities in the United States and in the Soviet Union, and the whole triad kicks in. So recognizing what's at stake there may be the control on what you're describing. But again, go back to that lens. Those are all rational.
right.
Both the use of the wrecking ball on the nail, that's a rational decision. The response to that wrecking ball from other nuclear powers is a reasoned, rational decision. That's not the sole driver in the nature of war. There's also that element of hatred and enmity and fear and irrational natural forces, and there's that probability, chance, unpredictability. So you cannot make and this is a lesson learned over and over again in warfare at all levels. You can never make, or should never, make decisions based on your assessment or understanding of a given party's intentions. You need to make those decisions based on their capabilities, their demonstrated, known capabilities. And so,
Like Maya Angelou said, when someone shows you who they are, believe them.
exactly, that's exactly right. And to a degree, all of this supposition in the media about Putin's mental state and does he have terminal cancer and all of these sorts of things, no. Take that. That all goes to intentions.
Don't do that. Yeah.
Don't do that. Don't do that. It makes no sense, and it distracts from the real issues. Okay, what are the capabilities, and then what is the rational decision involved? What is the element of enmity and hatred involved? And can we even predict things given the element of uncertainty involved? So that's the game we're playing right now. When you do that, you want really good players involved. And because some of our strategic decision-making and war-fighting capabilities have atrophied, certainly over 20 years of fighting small wars among the people, counterinsurgency, irregular warfare, countering extremism, whatever you want to call it, we don't necessarily have the right players, the right skill sets available.
It's not going to be as easy as getting a Dick Vermeil out of retirement.
That's right. You can't call in the left-hander.
Yeah, I guess to that point then too, there's a lot more players than just Ukraine and Russia here too, because we got Lukashenko, and who knows what he's going to be up to. He wants to put nukes in Belarus again.
Yes.
Poland is right there. They're increasing the size of their army in response to.
So there's an interesting point. So Poland is we have agreed to deliver to Poland M1A3 main battle tanks, the state of the art. The Poles, and they're actually getting what they want. Those are the Marine Corps' old tanks that were transferred to the Army, and now through foreign military sales, the Army is selling those to Poland. Highly capable vehicle, highly capable weapon system. So, yes, Poland's a player. Romania is a player. We have forces on the ground in Romania. We have the Black Sea Rotation Force. We have Marines that train in Romania routinely. You have other NATO members and non-NATO members, some of the EU, some not. All of those, but one of the key players that we really haven't talked about is Germany. It is largely Germany's dependence on Russian energy that is the limiting factor on what NATO is considering right now. Plus, they have seen this movie before.
Yeah.
Yeah, a couple times. And I guess it goes to your initial point when we first started, was that opening gambit. Depending on how, and obviously, speculation rolled according to Vic here, but had Kyiv fallen in those first 48 to 96 hours of this thing, Poland is definitely putting on their brown pants.
Yes.
Because the next phase then is a surge somewhere else, because we know that Russia's not, no one wants to get into regime change these days.
Yeah.
And I would submit that even more so than Poland,
Lithuania, Estonia.
that's correct. Yeah. The Baltics, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia,
Finland too.
and to a degree Finland, but particularly Latvia, the southern Baltics are access to the North Sea. All right. So again, in terms of a strategic asset, that now gives another place for the Russian fleet to refuel, rearm, and use as a base of operations that they used to have. Again, this goes back to that Throwback Thursday piece. In the days of the Soviet Union, those were Soviet socialist republics that the Red Navy were using on a regular basis. The Soviet Union collapses, they become independent nations, and now if you want to use our port, you've got to pay all these fees, and oh, by the way, maybe we don't want you here. We're not willing to sign that sort of treaty.
So they try and shove everything into Kaliningrad.
Right. And depending on the Baltic you're talking about, again, it isn't one size fits all. You have parts of the Baltics that align with Europe and Germany. You have parts that want to align really with Scandinavia and Finland, sort of a neutrality thing, and then you have Baltics that align with the Soviet or with Russia. So again, one size doesn't fit all there.
Well,
sir, thank you so much. This is awesome.
So it's a mess, and if it's not a mess, it'll work until the real mess happens, which may be next week.
Oh, yeah, it's
which
a mess,
may
but
be,
it can get messier.
Yeah, we may have to regroup on this at some point and account for current events as they occur. This is the challenge, but also the real value of studying a a real world, real time lesson in the theory and nature of war as it occurs.
Yeah. I think this is such a good exercise, I think, for us, and especially for the association, as we talk PME, because everything post long war has been Asia, island chain, and there have been a few outliers who said, and Marinus is one of them, has been, hey, just in case you guys aren't paying attention, like there's an entire other region of the world where things are not so
Exactly.
bueno.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So
All right.
before we go, sir, you mentioned last week some recommended reading to us. What would you recommend for all our young Marines or people interested in this to learn and study more to brush up on this part of the world?
Did you all make the recommendation of Bloodlands?
Yep.
Yeah, I
think
just
that's,
got it.
Yep, I think that's one of the primary books to read to understand the recent history of the region. All of Eastern Europe and its relationship with Russia focuses on the period really from the end of the Russian Revolution, the 1920s, up through the 1960s, 70s, and particularly focusing on Ukraine and what occurred / what was done to Ukraine. And there's still sort of widespread debate about it. What we know is that it was one of the largest scale famines in the history of the world. Whether it was entirely deliberate, as in a genocide, or somewhat accidental, as in bad collective socialist farming policies, the aggregate effect was the same. And those memories are alive and well in Ukraine and in parts of Russia as well. How the Ukraine behaved during World War II, again, significant portions of the population, mostly from the western part of the country, formed their own Nazi parties and their own SS units and became a franchise, if you will, of Hitler's forces, and fought against their countrymen and conducted pogroms in the country. Another great book to read, and also a pretty decent movie, is Defiance, talking specifically about Jewish partisans during the Holocaust in Ukraine. Best lesson there is ultimately the Ukrainian and German Nazis discovered that they messed around with the wrong group of Jews in Eastern Europe because culturally they were the smugglers, criminal element, and an extremely violent organized crime of rural Ukraine at that point. And the story of they're named after the two brothers that founded the group, the Bielski partisans, is a lesson in insurgency. In how it's done. And so that cultural memory is there in Ukraine also, even though the Bielskis left after the communists took over and actually lived in Brooklyn, New York, where I'm from. So those are two good books, and there's a lot of other writing out there. There's a lot of other books on the subject, but again, to understand sort of the history, I'd go there. And I mentioned the medieval piece to this. So another interesting little lens to look through, or data point, at the beginning of World War II, when the Germans first violated their mutual neutrality treaty with Stalin's Russia and invaded Russia, the Soviet propaganda machine went to work, and among other things, created a popular movie based on the story of the Kievan Prince Alexander Nevsky and his defense of Russia against the German and Lithuanian knights, and the battle on Lake Pripus, called the Battle on the Ice, where the heavy German cavalry cracked through the ice and the lightly armored Russian peasant soldiers. Okay, so there's Ukrainian history that is appropriated by Soviet Russia as a rallying propaganda tool to get the Russians, the Russian people, and the Russian military inspired to fight against the Germans invading Russia again. And it was phenomenally effective. And it's a great old movie to watch, old black and white, subtitled. Obviously, it's in Russian, and the score, the music written by Sergei Prokofiev, the great classical Russian composer. It is real propaganda. You'll come out of that movie wanting to fight for Mother Russia. So.
All right. Well, with that, we'll wrap it up here. Again, all of our opinions are just our opinions, and our facts need to be checked where possible. We
As
are
much
just-
as you can in the
Yep.
open source.
So we are dealing with same information that everybody else is. So,
And if you are in the know, please write in
yeah.
or leave us a message, or if you're in the area,
Come
maybe
on
we
our
could-
show.
Which
yeah,
segues nicely. We had Chief Warrant Officer Tad Tomusky reach out to us. He was in Crimea in 2006. It's an interesting story. We'll get that out for you guys later on in the week, next week maybe. And
yeah, that was really cool to hear his perspective.
that was awesome. So we will catch everybody on the flip. Catch you later.
Bye.